We know that air pollution kills a lot of people every year. Various numbers are put up. Maybe several million people die prematurely every year because of air pollution, and it's been linked to diabetes, of course, all kinds of respiratory problems, cardiovascular diseases, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and so on and so forth. This is much more specifically about whether air pollution affects mental health. Right? What does the research say? Research around the world has linked polluted air to increased risks of dementia, depression, anxiety, and psychosis. Air pollution and brain damage, what the science says. That's the tagline of this headline of this feature article in Nature that just appeared in mid-January. Epidemiological studies have linked dirty air to dementia and other brain disorders. Now researchers are trying to determine how pollutants actually do their damage. Finding correlation is one thing, but you have to prove causality to actually understand what's happening and find solutions as well. As you can see the mask here, then the question is, do the masks help reduce the impacts of air pollution? In 2012, Deborah Corey-Slechta at the University of, I don't know how it's pronounced, sorry, University of Rochester, New York, received a bucket of brains. A colleague had been studying how air pollution around the university harms hearts and lungs of mice and had asked Corey-Slechta to check the animals' brains for damage. As a specialist in the neurotoxicity of lead, Corey-Slechta remembers thinking, air pollution, how bad could this be? But what she saw in those brains was so astounding, she says, that it shifted her entire research focus. Focusing on how air pollution harms the brains landed Corey-Slechta in lonely territory. It's well established that the air pollution in the form of air particulate matter, PM, ozone, or other toxic gases contributes to asthma, lung cancer, and other respiratory illnesses, and that particulate matter especially contributes to heart diseases. But back then, she says, few people studying air pollution were interested in the brain, and even fewer neuroscientists were interested in air pollution. Her presentations got so little attention that at neuroscience conferences that she stopped attending the meetings. Now this area of research is getting more notice and prompting concerns around the globe. Study after study has shown that higher levels of air pollution are correlated with increased risks of dementia as well as higher rates of depression, anxiety, and psychosis. Researchers have also found links to neurodevelopmental conditions such as autism and cognitive deficits in children. Pollution cannot be good in any sense at all, but you have to still show causal links from air pollution to all these things: dementia, autism, cognitive deficits, and so on. In 2020, the influential Lancet Commission on Dementia recognized air pollution as a risk factor for the condition, and in its follow-up report last year, it stated that exposure to airborne particulate matter is now of intense concern and interest. Meanwhile, a 2022 report from the UK government's Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollutants called for more research on air pollutions linked to dementia. Likewise, the 2021 Global Air Quality Guidance from the World Health Organization emphasized the importance of studying air pollution's neurological effects on young and old people. The WHO estimates that 99% of the world's population is exposed to pollution above recommended levels, with many cities now in low and middle-income countries having particularly bad air quality. I have podcasts arguing or summarizing papers that say there is no clean air to breathe anywhere on the planet. That's pretty sad. But it's not just mega cities such as Mexico City and Delhi where people face risks. Even low-level exposure that people think is safe enough for public health is doing something at the brain level, says Megan Herding, a neuroscientist at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Researchers must now try to tease out the mechanisms behind these problems to take steps to mitigate such issues, says Ian Mudway, an environmental toxicologist at Imperial College London and a co-author of the 2022 UK report. For Mudway, the million-dollar question is, what is it in the air pollution which is driving these effects? Is this something specific, some chemical or deposition of a chemical on particulate matter, and so on and so forth? How small do they have to be to get into the bloodstream or into the brain, etc., right? So making the links then, studies of the brains of children and dogs in Mexico City in the late 2000s and early 2010s were among the first to raise alarms about air pollution's neurotoxicity. Neuroimaging revealed that many more children living in the highly polluted city of Mexico City had lesions in the white matter tracts that connect brain regions than did children in less polluted areas, with the prefrontal cortex seeming particularly vulnerable. So Mumbai is a good example where air pollution is much less, is not as bad as Delhi, not much less, but people get into a comfort zone saying, well, we are not as that bad, but it's still very unhealthy. And in India, many street dog problems are getting in the news all the time, with dogs attacking people. If they are living outside in the pollution and their brain is getting damaged, is there any link between air pollution and dog attacks? All kinds of questions come up, right? City children with no other risk factors for brain disorders performed comparatively poorly on cognitive tasks. So we'll see a blurb on the problematic proteins for more findings. Pollution, so that's somewhere here. So here, brain scans show areas of reduced cortical thickness in colored regions in children exposed to higher level of traffic pollution during their first years of life. Okay, so pollution is a hugely complex mix of gaseous and particulate components that differ depending on the source. Vehicle exhausts and industrial manufacturing are major sources of particles of various sizes, and cooking stoves, wildfires, and desert dust also contribute. Fuel combustion and other sources release nitrogen and sulfur oxides, carbon monoxide, and ozone. Studies in multiple countries, including in those where regulations have drastically improved air quality in recent decades, have found associations between pollution and specific brain disorders. A 2023 analysis of more than 389,000 participants in the UK Biobank showed that long-term exposure to airborne particulate matter, nitric oxide, and nitrogen dioxide correlated with higher levels of depression and anxiety. Okay, so these correlation studies are always very interesting, but one has to then obviously make all the links. Lead author Guoxing Li, an environmental toxicologist at Peking University in China, emphasizes that even very low exposure levels increase the risk of these conditions. Last month, that's in December 2024, a 16-year study of more than 200,000 residents in Scotland found that higher cumulative nitrogen dioxide exposure was associated with increased hospital admissions for mental health and behavioral disorders. Scotland doesn't come to mind when you think of pollution, but here you are. Meanwhile, studies in France, the United States, and China have documented that in regions where air quality has improved, there are decreased rates of dementia, cognitive decline, and depression in older populations. So how long does it take for pollution to be reduced and dementia reductions to show up? That has to be looked up. You can look up this paper. Observational studies have also linked air pollution to structural changes in the brain, such as reduced hippocampal volume, that are consistent with the heightened dementia risk in older adults that we looked at here. And herding studies of neuroimaging data from the developing brains of thousands of young people across the United States suggest that air pollution disrupts the development of white matter tracts. Last year, her team reported that an increase in exposure to air pollution seems to alter communication between brain regions because of these white tracts being damaged. But such studies have yet to converge on a clear pattern of damage. Herding says she suspects that the timing of exposure during the development might shape vulnerability. That's maybe good to know, because then you may be able to protect those age groups from pollution, and then they are better off for the rest of their lives, right? Despite all the evidence connecting air pollution with the damage to brain, researchers say that it's hard to pin down a clear cause using just observational studies. For example, people in poor communities who often breathe the worst air quality. I have somebody buzzing at my door. Give me a second here. Where am I? I'm trying to pause. It's somebody trying to sell junk food. Well, he's trying to make a living, but unfortunately he's selling unhealthy things, so sorry about that. Okay, so I have to get back. I have to go back into display mode and then find the laser pointer and see where we are. So despite all the evidence connecting air pollution with damage to the brain, researchers say that it's hard to pin down a clear cause using just observational studies. For example, people in poor communities who often breathe the worst quality air are likely to have more risk factors for brain disorders, stress, lower educational attainment, and obesity compared with those in higher income areas. So there are confounding factors, not pollution. It's not just air pollution. And many existing studies estimate exposure on the basis of residential addresses without accounting for how people's professions and lifestyles shape their exposure. So it's not just where they live. They may be going to work somewhere which may be more of a factor than where they are living. So there are issues. The specific types of pollutants that people breathe almost certainly matter, say researchers. Standard air quality measurements are based on levels of primary gaseous components and of particulate matter that have diameters less than 10 micrometers PM10 or 2.5 micrometers PM2.5. The smaller they are, the easier they have the chance of getting into bloodstream, digestive tract, lungs of course, but also bloodstream. But airborne particles carry a range of chemicals from simple salts to countless highly toxic compounds that vary across locations. All particles are treated as being equally toxic in these studies, says Mudway, yet they are a smorgasbord of every chemical and hundreds of thousands of chemicals in the air. What's more, ultrafine particles aren't routinely monitored, notes Corey Slechta. Yet, particles less than 100 nanometers across are the most chemically reactive airborne particles and the most likely to penetrate the body and brain, she says. So there's a lot of unknowns still. Even without this gap in monitoring data, Mudway says, observational studies of people breathing many pollutants cannot isolate the responsible chemicals to yield a mechanistic understanding of brain damage to air pollution. Cardiovascular disease is a known risk factor for dementia, so damage that air pollution does to the heart and blood vessels is another confounding factor for mental health, impacts on mental health. The only way to unravel it is through experimentation, which means you go back and put mice through pollution and try to see what happens to their brain. Cruel, but that's what we always do. So into the lab then. Lab studies can show, for example, that under controlled conditions, real-world cocktails of airborne pollutants harm the brain. This is what Corey Slechta saw in 2012 when she compared the brains of the mice that had breathed the air from around the university with those that had breathed filtered air. Subsequent studies from her lab reported that mice exposure to ultrafine particles during development, including in the womb from their mother's breathing, have enlarged white matter tracts and brain ventricles. Mice exposed during development went on to exhibit greater impulsivity and short-term memory deficits. So there is the causal link. There are some more details. Although signs of damage vary from study to study, Caleb Finch, who researches aging at the University of Southern California, says that there is one shared facet. It's an inflammatory response, he says. Air pollution causes inflammation. Studies from his lab and others show that the genes that mediate inflammatory responses are switched on. Messengers associated with the inflammation become more abundant. There are signs of oxidative stress, and microglial cells that sense damage and protect neurons are activated. Every major class of brain cell is affected, says Finch. Okay, so if the culprit is inflammation, that could explain why air pollution is a risk factor for multiple diseases. Inflammation is associated with mood disorders and age-related decline and has the potential to disrupt development. Inflammation makes systems work a little less well, Herding says, than other environmental and developmental factors going on in your daily life may be help tip the balance towards one versus the other disorder. Okay, so Corey Schlechter suspects that the brain can't cope with resulting metal concentrations, noting that for decades pathologists have seen elevated levels of various metals in the brains of people with neurodegenerative diseases. She is now studying how the metals disrupt brain chemistry, including dosing mice with various nanoparticles preparations that contain only one metal each. So again, we are pumping mice brains with all kinds of things to understand how we are affected. So knowing who is most susceptible to the harms of air pollution is important for understanding risk and could point to mechanisms. Researchers say air pollution might increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease to a greater extent in people with a gene variant APOE4, a known risk factor for Alzheimer's, says Finch. Other works in mice and humans point to potential sex differences in vulnerability to air pollution. There you go. So men and women may be differently vulnerable. This might depend on stage of life at exposure, says Corey Schlechter. What are the challenges that remain even as researchers call for further study of how air pollution affects mental health? They acknowledge the challenges. The effort is more complex than studying the effects of a single toxicant, and animal studies that replicate how humans are exposed to pollutants require expensive air control equipment not routinely used in neuroscience labs. Okay, so before we conclude, let's look at this problematic proteins that we mentioned before. Tissues from the brains of children living in metropolitan areas in Mexico City showed features linked to Alzheimer's disease, including amyloid beta plaque, top two panels here. So these are the plaques in brains growing up in polluted air. Neuronal phosphorylated tau protein in the bottom left here. Tangles and frontal pyramidal immunoreactivity of the DNA binding protein TDP43. So basically, there's some evidence that children living in metropolitan areas of Mexico City, which are highly polluted, show these issues of brain damage through these problematic proteins. Okay, but if successful, the efforts could pinpoint what pollutants are most problematic and thus inform regulations aimed at improving air quality, researchers say. That's referring back to the clean labs we need to do these studies. Often air quality measures focus on reducing the most abundant pollutants, but those might not be the most neurotoxic, says Mudway. At this point, the field still needs more neuroscientists, says David Jett, a program director at the U.S. National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes in Bethesda, Maryland, which in 2021 launched a key funding program to look at how environmental exposures, including air pollution, contribute to neurological disorders. Jett estimates that of the more than 22,000 delegates at the 2024 Society for Neuroscience meeting in Chicago, Illinois, fewer than 20 worked on air pollution. Out of 22,000, fewer than 20. Amazing. He attended to spread the word about the existing evidence and to urge neuroscientists to apply for funding to study air pollution. Slowly but surely it's working, says Jett, but not as fast as I would like to see. Okay, so obviously it's a good article which raises the issues and highlights the issues that remain, the challenges to addressing them. Anytime you have to use animals to experiment on and translate that science to humans, it's very tricky, right? So you have a cocktail of pollution that's affecting people, and the cocktails are different. The age group at which they are affected may have different impacts. Gender may be an issue, so very complicated, but it's a risk. So we have to just decide how are we going to deal with risks. Pollution is increasing, it's very bad in many places, decreasing in some places, let's say Beijing, because of all the rules and regulations they put in place, but it's still pretty bad. So we have to do something about it. So do we really need complete evidence to reduce air pollution? Not really, right? We should reduce air pollution anyways, and we will see many co-benefits coming out. So I'm going to leave it. I just wanted to include such, I always include such articles because they're useful and they point to directions. Global warming is one thing, but air pollution is really the killer right now, just in terms of the number of deaths caused by diseases, which often are directly or indirectly related to air pollution. So let me leave it here.